About 5 years ago, I got diagnosed with ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, and about 18 months ago, I was diagnosed by a clinical psychiatrist with severe adult ADHD to go along with my autism spectrum disorder. Now, I'd assumed that I'd just been drawn to photography because, it was just an interest, like most people, a hobby. But in the light of the diagnoses that I had for autism and ADHD, I realised that actually there may be something else going on here, and that there were other reasons why I was drawn to photography. But more than that, had an effect on the kind of photographs that I take. Now, I'm making this video because I strongly suspect there are quite a few people who have ASD or ADHD or both, like me, and are unaware of it. Okay, so let's talk about autism, and one of the key elements of this particular disorder is that people who have it often develop a very special interest in one particular subject area. If you've been watching any of the current TV shows that have been doing the rounds about autism, such as Love on the Spectrum on Netflix, then you'll know that it's very common for people with autism to develop this special interest. And it isn't necessarily a niche interest, sometimes it's quite general. I started taking up photography when I was about 10 years old, and by the age of 13, I was developing my own photographs in a makeshift darkroom in the family bathroom. One of the key elements of autism is a compulsion around routines, this burning need to keep things in a specific order, to stick to a routine. And it's certainly been the case pretty much my entire life. Every single day I would check the weather conditions and see if there was a likelihood of there being a decent sunrise or sunset. So mid-afternoon I would check the cloud forecast and see if there was going to be sunset colour. And before I went to bed, I would check the cloud forecast and see if there was going to be sunrise colour. We often talk about FOMO, the fear of missing out, and I have to say that my need to photograph colourful sunrise and sunset went way beyond that, and there are occasions where I left hot food on a table. One of the key elements of autism is that we find it quite difficult to have close friendships, and people with autism don't have too many people in their lives that they can call close friends. This is obviously absolutely perfect if you're a landscape photographer, and I know most photographers are extremely comfortable in their own skins, more than happy to be entirely on their own. So there you go, guys. I strongly believe that I've been self-treating my autism my entire life through the behaviours that I've just mentioned, with the special interests and going out to the landscape and this removing myself from social interactions. Have you done that? Are you like there's a book called The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, and I often think that they could do a book called The Loneliness of the Long Distance Landscape Photographer. We like being on our own, and I think that people with undiagnosed autism are drawn to photography partly because of that. So as I mentioned earlier, about 18 months ago I got diagnosed with severe ADHD. I read an article a couple of years ago in the Guardian newspaper where a guy was relating his life and how it had turned out. But that article really struck a chord with me, and it led to me going to see my GP and getting referred to a clinical psychiatrist who diagnosed me with severe ADHD. Now, I should point out, I should have said this earlier, that ADHD, like autism spectrum disorder, is not a psychiatric condition. There are physical differences in the brains of people who have it. And in the case of ADHD, that physical difference manifests itself in extremely low dopamine levels in the brain, amongst other things. Dopamine is an extremely important chemical messenger, and it's what we humans use to motivate ourselves to do things. If you have chronically low dopamine levels in your brain, then this manifests itself in a number of ways, and a lot of them are quite benign and just make you look a bit like a crappy human being. Unfortunately, one of the side effects of that low dopamine levels and the aforementioned inability to gird yourself up to do stuff that doesn't interest you means that if you have an interest in photography and ADHD makes it easy to pursue that, and you try and turn it into a business, then you find the business side of it way too hard to accomplish. People with ADHD are often drawn to creative industries such as acting and being pop stars and stuff like that, but they are terrible at organising their lives, and their financial histories are obviously a complete shit show, and they're terrible at doing the kind of routine nuts and bolts stuff associated with that. So we're good at the big picture things. You know, I'm great at going out and taking photographs, but if somebody contacts me and says they want to license a photograph, then I'm terrible at following that up and speaking to them and getting the photograph to them and all that kind of thing. It's not very politically correct to refer to ADHD as a superpower, as I discovered when I did that a while back, and was admonished because it's a serious mental disorder, which it is. But one of the key behaviours that comes along with ADHD is a thing called hyperfocus. Now, hyperfocus has nothing to do with an ability to focus on an object with your camera. It's the ability to totally immerse yourself in a specific task for prolonged periods of time. And I have found that is certainly the case with my photography. I get so immersed in the moment when I'm out photographing a nice landscape. So hyperfocus can be very useful in this regard, but don't go calling it a superpower or you'll get told off. One of the key behaviours of ADHD is that we are absolutely terrible at planning. We have an inability to look into the future and see how our behaviours might affect our later lives. So people with ADHD are terrible at things like arranging pensions, stuff that's way off in the distance. We're only really able to react to stuff once it's right in front of our faces. Now, this obviously doesn't often sit too well with photography, and it explains why I take photographs the way I do. Now, I often marvel at the photographs I see online where a photographer has gone to a particular location because there's a supermoon or the Milky Way's coming or there's going to be one of the regular meteor showers, and they work out all the logistics of taking the photograph and they put a plan of action in place and they go and they execute the plan and they take an amazing photograph. I could never do that. So for instance, I've taken some nice lightning photographs over the course of my photographic career, and that's not because I sat there with a weather map while the storm was, 24 hours away and worked out the trajectory. I just went to some of my favourite spots and sat there and hoped that I got some lightning shots, and occasionally I got lucky. However, for me, the most telling way that my ADHD manifests itself in my photography is the way that I actually conduct myself when I'm out taking my landscape photographs. Now, I love watching fellow YouTubers, photographers like Thomas Heaton, Mark Denny, and people like this, Andy Mumford, who's this Fujifilm photographer, going out and taking these photographs out in the landscape. And they have these processes that they go through, and they sit there and they go and look at a scene and they search for a photograph in there and try and do some sort of composition and all the rest of it. I don't do that. I've been giving this a bit of thought and I've decided that there are two kinds of photographers. There's the compositional photographer and there's the reactive photographer. I am 100% a reactive photographer. I go out with my camera and I react to the environment almost instantly. I see something, it interests me, I take a photograph and I move the fuck on. So while the likes of the serious chin stroking photographers like Thomas and Co might come back from a photo shoot with 3 photographs and consider it a win, I might come back with 300, of which maybe 30 are ones that I'd like to showcase. But the bottom line is that I end up with a lot more stuff because I'm constantly on the move, reacting, looking for things, shifting things up, looking for new perspectives, getting high, getting low, focusing in on things. I change lenses like crazy. I watch these photographers and they might have the same wide angle lens on their camera for the duration, but when I go out and photograph stuff, I always take at least 3 lenses with me. I take my nice wide angle lens, I usually take a nice prime so I can do beautiful bokeh shots down low, and I take a decent zoom, and I'm forever switching them out, sometimes within the space of a few minutes. Does that mean that I am not as good as the contemplative photographic types who, apply the rule of thirds or whatever and think long and hard about something before ever pressing the shutter button? Well, I'll let my photographs speak for themselves and you tell me. But this is a clear manifestation for me of ADHD and its impact on my photography. I don't think ahead of a scenario, I don't organise stuff. I'm a bit like the Joker in Batman. I don't think, I just do. And so the bottom line is that I think even if I wanted to be a more serious contemplative photographer, and I'm not saying incidentally there's anything wrong with that, it's cool. Photography is a broad church, there's room for everyone to do things their own way. But I just don't think I could do that, standing there for 30 minutes looking at a scene, ruminating on it and looking for angles. I use my camera, I see stuff immediately and I go and photograph, and if it doesn't work, I move on. One of the key behaviours that links ADHD and ASD is clumsiness, poor motor skills. And this is certainly something that's been true for my entire life. I'm forever walking into things, breaking things, and generally hurting myself. And it's also the reason why, as soon as I was able, I started insuring my camera equipment. I'm on my 3rd Fujifilm X-T4 camera. Here's my 2nd one. Do you know what happened to this? If you followed my channel, you'll know that I dropped it in a river. Yeah, I'm really clumsy. I was changing lenses, the lens cover was off, and it fell right face down into a saltwater river. And I'd had the camera, this was my first X-T4, for 2 weeks at that stage, and you can imagine how gutted I was. The 2nd of my X-T4s fell foul to this recklessness that comes with ADHD. People with ADHD, as I say, do not really fully understand the repercussions of actions, and we're quite reckless individuals, which can have huge life-changing impacts on our lives. It certainly has had on my life. So consequently, I often take more risks than I should do. For instance, one time I was in the Budary National Park here in beautiful Jervis Bay, and I saw a lovely scene. Now, it was taped off because they were rehabilitating the landscape. You weren't supposed to go down there, and the soil had suffered from being stripped of vegetation and was quite loose. And I should qualify this by saying, incidentally, that it was at the top of 80-metre cliffs. Now, I saw a photograph there, and a normal person might say, well, great, there's a photograph, but hey, mate, it looks a little bit tricky, looks a little bit dangerous, maybe give it a miss. But I didn't. So I hopped the tape, walked out onto this little cliff edge, and guess what happened? The soil started to give way, and I threw my camera bag. Fortunately, I hadn't taken my camera out of the bag by that point. I threw the bag up the slope, and as I fell down, I managed to grab a tree root, and it was only that stopped me plummeting 80 metres down the cliff to my death. And there have been many, many instances of this throughout my life. It's one of the main reasons why my wife Catherine refuses to come with me. She shits herself every time she sees me within a few metres of a cliff edge. And that risk-taking behaviour was what led to the death of my 2nd Fujifilm X-T4 camera. when I was photographing a massive swell at Bombo Quarry, a very famous landscape photography location near here. And I went too close to the edge in order to get the shot. I didn't, really think about any of the repercussions or the dangers involved in it. I just have this kind of she'll be right, mate attitude. I'll be all right. And this absolutely enormous wave came over the top of the massive cliffs there. Probably the biggest wave I've ever seen at that location. And it absolutely soaked me. I was effectively underwater for a second or two as this massive water came over me. And I was very lucky not to be swept off into the water and off to my death. But unfortunately, the X-T4 clocked it right on the head, and while the camera was weather sealed, the lens was not, and water got in and ruined it. Now, along with mental disorders like autism spectrum disorder and ADHD come some allied disorders such as depression, bipolar and anxiety, and people often have a mixture of all of these 5 things. And so when I'm feeling the effects of depression and I'm in one of my black dog days, the best thing I can do is load up the camera backpack and head off out into the landscape and take some photographs. Reconnecting with nature is absolutely terrific for the mood. I find it very, very helpful for me. It helps me get back on balance. And often when I return from being out taking photographs, if I've gone out in a bit of a black dog day mood, I come back and I'm a different person. People with ADHD are often obese, and that's certainly the case for me. And there are many health benefits in going out into the landscape with all this stuff. You're walking around, you're hiking with all this equipment, you get a little bit healthier in the process. So there you go, guys. That is how I discovered quite late in life that a couple of mental disorders had a huge bearing on my interest in photography. And if anything I've said has struck a chord with you, then I suggest you do a bit of light reading around the subject, and you might want to pursue your own diagnosis. All right, that'll do for this video, guys. I know it's a little bit different to the usual stuff I'm talking about with Lightroom and predicting sunset color and all that kind of stuff, but I hope it helped somebody out there in YouTube land. If it did, please hit the old like and subscribe buttons, and I will see you on the next one.